I think we'll get started here. Welcome to the 2016 Arthur Robinson Colloquium. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I'll introduce our guest in a moment, but let me say a few words in preparation about Arthur Robinson. He received his PhD in 1947, a long time ago, and also received an honorary doctorate as well, both from Ohio State. He got his honorary doctorate in 1984. And of course, he's famous for creating the Robinson projection. And his map projection has been adopted extensively by the National Geographic Society. He had a distinguished teaching and research career, as I'm sure many of you know. And he was a towering figure of geography and cartography at Wisconsin. And he passed away, unfortunately, in 2004. But we're very proud of our association with our alum. And we are pleased that one of our emeritus professors, Joel Robinson, wrote a detailed biography and obituary for the Annals that appeared in 2008. We've included that in the package of items we're going to give to Matt, so you'll know more about that. But Robbie was a great guy, and he also endowed some funds to help support our graduate and undergraduate students. So there is actually something called the Robinson Fund, which has a fair bit of money in it, and through that supports undergraduate and graduate research. And this year, in fact, we're using that to help boost the recruiting of our next cohort of incoming graduate students. So we have already talked about that. And then just another thank you, the Colloquium series that you see here and the reception we have later, and our guest is sponsored with support from John Nelson, who gave funds to the department for the Colloquium Fund. And this is something that allows us to run both the Robinson Colloquium and the TAFE Colloquium, the two marquee events of the year. And let me thank the Visiting Speakers Program and Ola particularly for helping to plan these events, and I think Harvey for hosting Matt for some of the time, and for you all for meeting with Matt during his visit. So not to be intimidating, but let me just list some of the people who precede you. So Reg College, Mike Goodchild, Keith Clark, Stuart Fotheringham, Mike Batty, Harvey Miller, and a large number of other well-known names have given Robinson Colloquium, so you're joining an elite crew. And we will put your plaque with a name in the hallway later. And thank you for coming. And we would like now to introduce some aspects of your career and welcome Matt Zook to the department. So Matt is an associate professor at the University of Kentucky. He received a PhD from Berkeley in 2001. And he has wide interests including GeoWeb, economic geography, augmented reality, geosocial media, and other research, and I'm reading this from some of his website. Now, we haven't met, but I've cited his work, and I think he's some of mine, and he has dozens of papers, including a collaboration with Tony Grubsek, who is a graduate of this department. He's also, I just picked one fact from his many, many interesting aspects of his biography. He's director of the Dolly Project, which is data on local life and you, and it is a repository of billions of geolocated data, tweets that allow for research and analysis. It sounds like an intriguing data set. I know many of you have interacted with Matt during his visit and look forward to his talk. So in anticipation, let me just present you with some stuff. We won't go into the entire details of the contents of this bag. It does include a collectible item, no longer available geography t-shirt, a special water bottle, and the Joel Morrison biography of Arthur Robinson, which I think you'll find interesting. Very, very good stuff. And since you drove, there's no weight limit on what you carry back. So welcome to the department. We look forward to your talk. Thanks for coming. Thank you very much.
Really hoping there wouldn't be a discussion about who's given this talk before. So now I'm feeling a bit more nervous than I might have. But I want to thank everyone for inviting me here. I've been telling people that I was born in Pennsylvania, I grew up in Indiana, and I actually did a lot of traffic across Ohio. But until this week, Columbus for me was just this sort of like jog out of the way from one place to another. So it's really nice to have the chance to visit. I'm actually, it seems silly that I haven't been up here visiting the department earlier, but I'm particularly honored to be here for the Arthur Robinson Colloquium. And to that end, I'm trying to focus or make this talk, which is sort of a combination of a couple different research projects and papers that I pulled together in, pulled together for, a couple of different projects and papers that I pulled together into this talk. It also represents some new work that I'm sort of developing right now. That's sort of the mapping culture part. I'll get to that as well. And I'll also talk specifically about this Dolly database, which I've used for a lot of this research. So what really has been driving my work for the past couple of years has been this phenomenon as big data. And I put this word cloud up here sort of somewhat ironically, because in some ways that's how people think about big data. It's a big, massive stuff. There's a couple words that pop out here. But this is really sort of an increasingly prevalent across the board. I was talking to people, I know there's some like big data, sort of cluster hires or whatever the term is for here. I think it's really sort of an interesting and important opportunity for social sciences, geography as well. And again, just the obligatory Google Trends. It's not something that's been talked a whole lot about until relatively recently. We have a whole slew of journals that are coming out that have the term big data. I want to sort of draw particular attention to this one, Big Data in Society, partly because I'm one of the co-editors for it, so if you have any papers that touch on this, please send them my way. But also, trying to say what this talk is focused on, not in opposition, but as sort of as a difference from a lot of these big data journals that are really focused on algorithms or the techniques, very sort of computer sciencey. What Big Data in Society, the journal, is doing, what I'm trying to do in my own research in this talk, is thinking about, where is this big data coming from? How is it constructed? What role are, the sort of social construction of this data? How is code and algorithms shaping this? Sort of thinking more broadly about the practices that are associated with big data rather than how best to use it. So that's the focus I'm coming on with this. And for this talk, I have sort of three big parts of it. First, I want to sort of do a bit of overview, sort of saying, this is how we might use big data. There's some really interesting aspects to it. I'll show you some of the work I'm currently doing just really recently, but also some of the stuff that has developed in more recent, or has been published and completed. Then I want to sort of talk about this idea of what's the title of the talk, how to socialize data, the need to socialize data, put it in context both as being something that's humanly constructed, but also increasingly this element of coded construction, and the element of algorithms and software, and doing various rankings and presenting things to us in certain ways, representing the world in certain ways. And then tie it back to something I've increasingly been focused on more recently, thinking about how the use of big data, the phenomenon of big data practices play out for a set of policies known as smart cities. How, some people are talking about how we should be governing and working with cities in the future. So when I say big data, it means a lot of things. This is what I mean by big data. It's a slide I've used in a lot of talks. It's sort of, I'm really focused on the social media aspects, or the sort of crowdsourced aspects of big data. And this is sort of increasing the phenomenon of what we see when we're working, or what we don't see as we're walking through our cities. There's this whole layer of information, tweets, Instagram photos, reviews, and things like that, that people are pushing out. It's possible to collect some of this data and use it for some interesting research, in some cases perhaps even governance of cities and other sort of aspects of our daily life. So to talk about the research project that I'm working on right now, this is the Mapping Culture Cities. I will say when I gave this title for this talk, I thought, I think as many people think it was going to be farther along than it was at this point. So this is relative. This is really some pretty preliminary work. I still want to talk about it because I think it's actually a good example of how we think about how we might use data. This is part of a project with two other folks, Dominic Powers, an economic geographer at Uppsala, and Otto Porthouse is at Singapore now, sort of GI science and sort of geodetic projects he works on. And what we're looking at for this project, and before I get into what we're doing, this aspect of culture, I first want to talk a bit about one of the issues with social media data or big data is understanding what does it signify? What does a tweet mean? What does a Facebook post mean? Because often, and this is sort of a critique of some big data sort of approaches, I think there's a lot more meaning ascribed to a particular text in a tweet or something like that, and so forth. And so what I really want to claim here is just there's a tension. A tweet, and we're using Twitter in this case, is a signifier of attention to a particular phenomenon. In this case, we're looking at fashion, the fashion industry. Part of this is driven by Dominic Powers, who's done a lot of work in cultural economies. Fashion is a really interesting cultural economy. It's a big cultural economy. And it's also lends itself very much to a social media platform. This is how people talk about fashion brands and designers want people to talk about them on social media. It's sort of one of the currencies by which they become known. So we picked this project with some care to use this particular big data. We collected a fairly, at this point it's very much exploratory research. We collected about 900 different terms from these listings of the top 500 fashion trends. I forget the exact name of the source on this over several years. There was a list of designers, models, retailers, organizations, and so forth. And basically collected tweets that contain these various terms from this database we have at the University of Kentucky. I can talk more about this, but this is the Dolly project that Morton was talking about. Essentially, at this point, it's about 12 billion tweets, and it's every geotagged tweet sent for the past 3.5 years. It's about 1 or 2% of tweets are geotagged, so it's not a full look at what's happening on Twitter, but it's one that we can use in terms of mapping applications. We then did this set up a series of scripts where we extracted this data and then did this mapping through a combination of Ruby code and R. And we're mapping here bin to odd ratios. An odd ratio is sort of like a location push. It's essentially, it's a normalization technique, because one of the things that you often see with this kind of big data is people make a map of place marks or data points, and you'll just see, well, this is where the people are because it's social media. This is normalizing a particular tweet. So if someone is tweeting about Benetton or a particular location, it's how many people are tweeting about Benetton relative to the total amount of Twitter activity. So to adjust for a place doesn't have a lot of Twitter activity, one tweet can completely skew this, and this is a way of controlling for this. So just to run through a couple of these maps, I'm going to do this fairly quickly, but just to sort of show you what one can do this. And again, the way to think about this is it's a geography of attention to various fashion brands. So this is Benetton. They're based in Italy, and you see a concentration in Italy, throughout sort of Eastern Europe, some interesting clusters in Mexico as well. I can't actually speak to sort of causal factors behind this, because literally we just got these maps earlier this week. But you can see a particular interesting, intriguing pattern, or spatial pattern. Particularly if you look at another sort of fashion brand, Brooke Brothers, it's a completely much more American-centric kind of geography attention. You look at another brand, in this case J. Crew, also very American-centric, but a different, again, sort of a different distribution. And just to point out, in these particular codings, the darker colors, anything above 1 indicates a higher than expected level of attention. So you can sort of ignore the red. Again, these are sort of preliminary maps, so we haven't gotten some coloration as dialed in as we might want on this. And again, we're using hexagons here, this hex bin, this binning of the individual tweets, because it allows us to look at sort of a global, take a global look. I'll show you some other sort of scaled down versions as well. You look at converse. Converse in the case of the US is there's not a particular center of attention. This is sort of a middle category, but you can see for some reason it's very popular, or there's a lot of attention to Converse within some of the Scandinavian countries. Ralph Lauren, Tommy Hilfiger. Again, I'm just putting these out to sort of show some of the patterns we might do. And again, this is the early exploratory version. Lacoste is, again, you can see patterns. And again, I'm not sure if this is, for example, for Turkey, is that attention to it as a brand, or is that attention to it as a manufacturing site facility. I'm not quite sure what the distribution of the costs to manufacturing centers are. Could be either. Other thing I want to point out to some of the problems with this. This is a brand. I'm not actually familiar with this. Osklin is based out of Brazil, and so you do see a real concentration of this within Brazil. But Brazil is also one of these countries that is very active in Twitter. It is a very makes use of this particular social media quite a bit, much more than other countries. And so that is, again, a bias within this data, and why, when we start working with this more, we're going to have to sort of consider how we might do this, particularly if you look at another sort of designer, Alice Poyser, who's based in Kenya. You can see, again, there's not much activity going on about her. If there was more activity going on in Twitter in general in Kenya, perhaps she would show up more. Again, I put these out just because I want to sort of give you sort of a sense of some of the current work we're doing, but I also want to sort of talk about how this can be applied to at the urban scale. You can shift this down. Again, all these points are we're gathering these point data, we're aggregating up these bin to these hex bins, and so we can shift scales fairly easily and look at different sets of questions. For example, one of the things we did. Another sort of project is, rather than looking at the text of the tweet, we looked at the user profile. In Twitter, you can define your profile however you want, use different language. We simply picked out user profiles that either were described themselves as a banker or an artist, and then mapped the distribution of where people were sending their tweets from. In this particular map, the darker hexagons indicate these are places where people who self-identified as bankers sent a lot more tweets than people who self-identified as artists. So you can see, Upper East Side, Upper West Side, sort of residential areas, the financial districts, some interesting bedroom communities, as well as airports. Again, there is other work that we're still working on in terms of how you might use something like this to identify processes of gentrification. We haven't really made a whole lot of headway on that, but could see something similar, particularly seeing these sort of location of tweets over time, particularly if we got to the point where we have a nice sort of 3.5 years. This is something we just started talking about how we might do this. Another example, this is from a published paper that recently came out in Land, again with a couple co-authors working on this, is looking at the case of essentially activity space and mobility within the case of Louisville. This is just to show you how useless it is just to map tweets. This is just a map of all the tweets that were sent in Louisville, and essentially you get the big residential areas, downtown, and so forth. And this is where a lot of analysis sort of starts, and people are sort of happy with it. It's becoming less the case. People are getting a bit more sophisticated. But we wanted to do something different with this kind of analysis because we wanted to look at how different people from different neighborhoods actually are using the city, how they move from place to place. And so within Louisville, there is a commonly understood divide. It's called the 9th Street Divide. It's essentially right there. And within the popular culture or the popular understanding of people who live in Louisville, you do not cross the divide. The people on this side do not go here, the people on this side do not go there. Sort of a classic sort of tail segregation. The West End is relatively is predominantly poor, predominantly African American. The East Side is more suburban, more well-to-do, and a whiter population. So what we did, we took these individual tweets and then we started assigning individual Twitter users to a neighborhood, either a West End or East End neighborhood, and based on where most of their tweets were coming from. And then we looked at the activity space based on these two classifications. And what we found was really sort of ran counter to this particular understanding of how people were using and moving the city. For the East Enders, this divide was very real. Very few people who were sending tweets who we defined as East End, from the East End neighborhood, were sending tweets from the West End. From the West End, a much more global population. There was not this divide in terms of West End. People would cross this 9th Street divide and do this tweeting activity. Now, of course, lots of reasons might be tied into this. It's not something we did in this particular paper, but in terms of employment centers, retail centers, and so forth, that inner city neighborhoods are generally lacking in, would help to explain this kind of pattern. But we were mainly interested in showing that, okay, this commonly understood function of the city, if you start looking with social media data, you can show it's not functioning that way, or it's a much more complicated story than simply the body. Now, I wanted to put these out as a couple of examples of how one might use social media data, or sort of big social media data. I am trying to sort of walk a line here in terms of thinking about how it can be usefully done, but also being very, very aware of sort of limitations of this as well. And so I'm going to start talking about that. But I really do want to say that I think there's a lot of potential here, particularly for studying problems in new ways. It's not necessarily easy, and you got to be very careful about how far one might push the interpretation of the data. That's why I'm talking about geographies of attention and this sort of this movement back and forth within the case of Louisville. So now let me talk a little bit about the next part. What are some of the problems? What I mean by this idea of socializing data? How is it constructed? How is it socially constructed? How is it code? What role does code play? And the way I normally do this is this. This is, not this particular map, but this kind of interface is probably one of the most looked at maps or uses of maps today. I mean, it's a Google map search. For this one, I did good restaurants in Columbus, Ohio, mainly because that always gets people's interest. People start looking at the list and seeing what, if they agree with that list and so forth. And I want to be clear, I'm not criticizing. This is incredibly useful. I use this all the time. It's a really useful way of getting around finding things. But this is really a big moment of power. This is a moment of cartographic power in terms of what ends up listed here. You can see, the ratings. It's not ranked by ratings. It's not ranked by the scores. There's something that's going on behind the scenes. There's a code. There's a coded algorithm that is producing this particular view of Columbus. Part of it is based on my previous searches. Do I like steakhouses? Do I like taquerias? That can sometimes go in. And this is sort of a secret sauce that Google doesn't talk about. But there are lots of search engine optimization companies out there to try to tell you, I can get you on the top of the list. Even things like the iconography. I mean, why are some of these things represented by a single red dot, and other things are, made much larger? They call attention. These are all the sort of ways that cartographers are well familiar with how you bring attention to certain things and sort of downplay other things. And this is all happening in the flash of an eye. This happens again and again. This is something that there's power happening here. I'm not saying we should do away with it or we need to stop it, but this is something that we need to pay attention to and be aware of. Because this is how data is being used, data is being ranked, constructed, and so forth. There's something that people have been talking about. Thrift and French talked about the automatic production of space and software. Rob Kitchen and Martin Dodge talked about code space. Rob's also talked a lot about some of these the data deluge, data assemblages, and so forth. These are increasingly important in how representation, particularly urban representations, are being presented to us as our lives are mediated through our smartphones. Again, just wanting to emphasize, this is a key part of, this code is a key part of how things get brought together and really instrumental in how big data is constructed and presented to us. It deals with a lot of long-standing issues. I mean, Harv and Mike Goodchild had, good insight on how we might approach, using this sort of big data in geographic research. But there are other problems too with data. Another sort of a quick example is who's authoring this data? Where's this data coming from? This map is a map of the percentage of local edits made to a Wikipedia page. And our Wikipedia pages can have geographic coordinates. So these are the percentage of edits made to these pages by locals, limiting to the English Wikipedia. The non-English Wikipedias tend not to look quite this bad, but they're still pretty lopsided the same way. In this map, countries that are shaded this bright yellow have less than 5% of the edits about them, a lot in Wikipedia being made by locals. The data about these places is being written by people elsewhere. And this, you can see sort of, this operates across scales too. You can sort of see a similar phenomenon, though it's much rougher at different scales as well, in terms of who is actually doing the writing about particular places. It's not necessarily the people who actually live and inhabit this space. So again, that's another issue and problem with data. Another one, this is language is a big issue. How are things coded? How is the data? Is it coded with an English term? Is it coded with an English term and another language term? That's how, and you can have these associations that get built up through software as well. But there's also just the simple, how is this stuff indexed? This example is doing a search at the exact same location in Tel Aviv for a restaurant in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. You can see we get very different results, and just in terms of the total numbers, but completely different sets of restaurants. Again, depending on who you are, depending on how your search is, depending on how the code has been written to serve this stuff up, you can get completely different representations of a particular location. And I bring this up because this starts playing into what we might expect from sort of smart city policies or how smart cities are operationalized in day-to-day life. Last quick example is the social media platforms themselves. They're constantly tinkering with the code. You probably have the experience of that your Facebook feed, why do certain things show up in your Facebook feed rather than other sort of things? This is because these social media companies are adjusting, they're trying to optimize some things one day, another thing another day. Facebook got into quite a big sort of hot water about 1.5 years ago by running this sort of happiness experience, or this emotional experiment where they made some people slightly less happy by promoting Facebook posts that were more negative, and other people slightly more happy by putting other things. They got in a lot of trouble, but that kind of tinkering of code is happening all the time. And there's particularly this interesting character, Christian Rudder. He runs OkCupid, it's an online dating site. And he, at that time, he came out very bold to say, we're experimenting all the time. We don't know how to make a match. There's not like a best answer. So we're constantly tinkering with this stuff. And he came out very boldly in saying that. Now, I don't want to really say much more about this, but just again to call attention that there's all this sort of human activity that's in terms of constructing the data, constructing big data. There's all this coded activities, algorithmic activity that is ranking, making some things more visible and other things less visible. So it's a key takeaway. So what I now want to do is sort of try to bring these two ideas together. That big data is potentially useful, and also this sort of problematic or sort of this sort of hidden sort of power going on behind with the code behind how data comes up. There's also a lot of human activity that's selecting certain code versus others. But just think about how this plays out in smart city policies. And this is stuff that people are actually doing. These are smart city policies show up in more and more, a lot more cities. It's sort of, I guess in some ways, it's sort of the trendy urban planning kind of thing right now. You see a lot of attention focused on this. And one thing that sort of driven my sort of thinking on this bit was this email that I got from about 1 year ago from urban informatics professional. No one in this room, I'll say it right now, because I'm going to sort of critique or sort of think about this a bit. This is someone who was emailing me, we were having a conversation about the Twitter database we have in Kentucky. Didn't really go anywhere, but this really struck me as a sentence that he had in his first email. Our broad research question is using social media data to run a city better. Use this to run a city better, make better decisions and so forth. But at the same time, knowing this person's background, again, a lot of the people who do this kind of stuff with big data are coming from computer science backgrounds. I've seen very naive approaches to data, sort of assuming that data is, unproblematic. And so that sort of, set me thinking, so a whole set of questions. I mean, how do we actually do this in practical terms? How might we use social media data? I gave you some examples in terms of the fashion industry, the distribution. I mean, those are not that well developed. I think the other examples in terms of maybe some of the activity space of certain individuals classified either by their self-declared descriptions or their neighborhoods have more potential. But what are the assumptions? How do we critique them? But more importantly, what's the bigger vision that's associated with this? So, because there's a lot of visions associated with smart cities about making cities better, more efficient, and that is coming from a particular place. I'll talk more about that in a bit. But first I wanted to sort of talk about this long history of what I'm calling smarter cities. I mean, they're not smart cities, but people have been talking about gathering data, thinking about this, trying to make better decisions for a long time. And I guess this is actually sort of a moment of confession. I am not actually a geographer. All my degrees are in city and regional planning. It's quite annoyance to my chair, who every year has to justify why I'm allowed to teach in geography. So this is something that I sort of come back and I started thinking, and I am a geographer, I'll say, but officially I'm not, at least according to SACS, the accreditation agency. But I was thinking about a lot about the history of how people have been thinking about urban planning, how you might go about doing it. Because people have been thinking about it for a long time. You go all the way back to Ebenezer Howard, these beautiful garden cities with these very sort of exact rows and circles and wedges, that taking this really complicated thing that's a city, very sort of messy and complicated, and bringing this certain amount of order to it. And that was many times that's sort of, or many ways that's what people point to as the start of city planning. Another perhaps less known example is Patrick Geddes. He's often thought of the founder, the person who started out regional planning, and he had he wasn't that sort of exact. He was sort of a classic 19th century academic who was into biology, sociology, all over the place. And he had this really sort of interesting vision of this outlook tower in Edinburgh. And he used the sort of cutting edge technology at the time, which is this camera obscura, which is essentially a big light gathering device that then projects onto a table down within, and you can sort of see the surrounding countryside. And his vision was, you go into the outlook tower, you look at all the surrounding regions to see life whole. You get all this information. I think in many ways it's sort of the same sort of goal that we see in smart cities. We want to get all the information. We want to understand what's going on. We want to promote that. Obviously this camera obscura was just again a visual image. There weren't it wasn't getting all the data, all kinds of sort of issues with it. But his sort of vision, his set of goals were in some ways reflect or sort of very, very much parallel some of the stuff we see in smart cities today. There's more recent examples of this too. This is one that I've never, hadn't really known about until I read this great book by Medina talking about this project called Project CyberSyn, which was put into place during the Allende years in Chile in the early 1970s. And it was a similar project. It was basically to build a computer system, but at that time it was like telexes and a mainframe computer. The technology was, from our point of view, very primitive, that would get all this information from factories and other places, bring it all to this sort of central operations room, and people, the decision makers there, could base that, these incoming data streams and make good decisions. I will say, this never was actually put into practice. The only sort of real, what was left was this amazingly delightful Star Trek-esque set of chairs in the command center that was sort of put together as a prototype. And you can see there's all kinds of issues, stuff going behind the scene. There's this beautiful, this vision of all this stuff flowing in very easily. But if you had data up here or sort of reports, these would have been sort of had to have been tallied by people outside this room who would also then project it through various sets. It never was very a practical thing, but it was very much a vision. And again, since it was a yen day, it was very much sort of a certain set of socialist visions, goals that we're putting on here. This is all about trying to make the economy better and share it with the workers of Chile. They also had this wonderful little device called the algodomic meter, which was designed to measure how happy Chileans were with the government at any given time. I'm not quite sure how this worked, except it was supposed to be on top of TV sets. And there was some sort of something with voltage regulators or something. I'm not sure if you turned a knob or anything like that, and how it was going to be aggregated or anything like that. I don't think this is like really an example of a practical thing, but there was this idea. One of the data streams you want to bring in for Project Cybersyn was the people's happiness. And they tried to see how they might implement that. Now, fast forward today, this is what we have. This stuff has been actualized. Getty's vision of having all this data coming in, the Cybersyn project has been actualized in some cases in very real ways. This is Rio de Janeiro's Intelligence Center. This has been, I forget exactly when it went in operation, maybe about 2014, 2013. It's generally been seen as one of the key sort of examples of this sort of approach, all these different data streams coming in. You can see some images from it. But again, it's specific kinds of data. GPS tracked movements of the garbage trucks, dash cams of the buses, weather, precipitation, things like that. There's lots of interesting stuff coming in, but it's not necessarily the whole city. And again, these things are designed to be sort of real-time reflections of what's actually going on in the city. But again, depending on what data is coming in, it is, of course, a snapshot or a subset of that. Now, there's lots of critiques about the smart city movement. I mean, again, it's really, it's clearly sort of emerging in part, or emerging for this sort of neoliberalism, this attempt to shrink down government austerity programs, privatize various things. There's this real push and sort of emphasis on making governments run more efficiently. There's also a real element of profit seeking by technology companies, because technology companies are the ones who are going to sell the equipment, sell the software to these cities, all kinds of issues. And you see ads like this from IBM talking about pushing these sort of ideas. Forget this, being smarter can change the way cities work and deliver the potential as never before. I mean, sort of, classic sort of corporate rhetoric going on there. And I don't want to discount that stuff, but I also want to sort of draw attention to this moment that it's also very much sort of driven by data and visualization. There's all this data out there. Data visualization, the whole sort of data viz industry has gotten much, much bigger over the past decade, 5 years even. Data science was not even a career path or occupational category until relatively recently. And again, this is also tied into driving this stuff forward. And the thing that's really interesting for me is that there is lots, and for geography, there's lots of parallels to what geographers have been talking about, or cartographers, map makers, in thinking about how do we understand things and how might we use this, particularly to help parts of the community that we might want to prioritize. This is just an example of one of the companies that's sort of offering this stuff. I think there's this sort of business or sort of visualization intelligence or this information intelligence, particularly nice, sort of rhetoric here. We are overwhelmed by information. Information lies stagnant in rapidly expanding pools. You need to do something. There's sort of an urgency that's being pushed out here as well for this. And this is again, one of the motivating factors behind smart cities, and also one of the reasons I'm a little concerned about how is this data being selected, how is this data being processed, how is it being used? Is it being situated in all its complexity as we may hope? But there's so much of this data. And there's also this thing that Mattern refers to as dashboard governance. I was talking to Barb and some others earlier about sort of this whole idea of dashboards. These are sort of a very popular thing right now. And it's this idea of, rather than necessarily having a physical operation center, that those are happening as well, you have a coalition or a coalition. You bring together all these different data streams in one sort of dashboard information interface to think about how we might, what's happening in the city in real time. It's also really useful for benchmarking, which is also another part popular thing with smart cities. Are we better than Kansas City? Are we better than New York? So forth and so on. People get paid to push these sort of metrics. And so this is an example from London. You might see some of the expected stuff. You have sort of weather reports up here, what's happening in the airport forecasts. You have tube line status. There's lots of information on the bikes and things like that I'm sure Harv would be quite happy to see as well. There's news items. There's also, there's also some strange stuff. This is the one I like to point out to. This is the stock index. How important is the current stock index to the daily life in London?
Very.
It's not, well, yeah, very, yeah, it depends. The point is, okay, stocks go up and down. It's not really going to change, an urban decision maker there. It shows up because one of the things that drives these is you want to have updated streams that can be constantly updated. Something's always changing with the stock market. It's a useful thing to have. Whether or not it was picked there because someone thought it was an important indicator, whether it was sort of a pick by convenience, is sort of the point I'm trying to sort of think through on this. And again, this really gets at the questions of what kind of stories can be told with this data. And this is a very sort of different set of goals, a set of vision than the Ende project we saw in Project Cybersyn. Different sort of ideologies in place. Rather than a socialist ideology with the Ende years, you have this more neoliberal about shrinking government and making things more efficient. And that drives decisions about what shows up in the dashboard, what might not show up in the dashboard. And really sort of brings up the question, how might we do this different? What's important to measure? What's politically expedient to measure? How do we process this? How do we put this, how do we bring this stuff in? And one of the examples I like to point out at this point is, the decision to measure something or bring it into a dashboard or not is really, this is a moment of power. And just to give you an example, this is a map from Bill Bunge's expedition to Detroit, where he mapped regions of frequent rat sightings and confirmed rat bites. Now, this is problematic for an urban dashboard for a couple reasons. First, there's probably not a government in the world that's going to have a little trend line on number of rat bites in their city. There's a political aspect. And again, politics tends to get pushed aside on a lot of these things in terms of bringing the data in. There's not, the political dimension is just sort of, well, we don't really worry about it. Second, I don't know where the stream on rat bites is going to come from. One might think that some of the social media stuff could serve, maybe not particularly for rat bites, but for some sort of element that's sort of similar to that. But, or that sort of mood of the population that the Cybersyn project was thinking of. But again, in some ways that's a very evocative, very important thing, but how do we bring this into a data stream in the case of a smart city kind of project? And again, it's really about what gets measured. And some things are easy to measure, some things are already measured. Traffic counts with cameras are relatively easy to gather. Metrics on citizenship, social justice, are much more complicated. And I want to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying we should come up with a metric of social justice, because that's a whole other set of problems. Because once you define something as a metric, then the next tendency is to try to essentially optimize towards that metric. So if social justice is measured by certain, we've all done this. Whenever we have a metric in terms of it, if it's enrollments in classes or pass rates and stuff like that, we will optimize to based on the metric. And so, but I also think there's an argument that having that on the dashboard as something that should be pushed forward is also important. That you can make an argument that we should have some sort of sense of social justice on these sort of urban dashboards rather than limiting it to traffic and so forth. And that those sort of things are that can be readily measured by GPS or smartphones. Smartphones is also sort of interesting device. These increasingly proximate people have talked about. We've talked about today, like doing these ideas of measuring noise within Columbus based on smartphones. You download an app, you can have sort of noise pollution, but it's really sort of limited to what kind of things are in this device. You have a accelerometer, GPS, and we're not necessarily collecting data we want to collect. We're collecting data that we're able to collect. It's always sort of a problem. And often the stuff we're able to collect can be used, can be turned into something that makes sense for what we're to ask the questions we really want to. But still, we're limited by what we have, and smartphones are one of these things that are all over the place. And the reason, again, just to sort of end up on this, the reason that, again, I'm concerned about this stuff is that data and these metrics can be really performative. There's this great bit of work by Mackenzie looking at these financial models that were developed to predict what was going to happen in certain markets and how they came to start defining how the market actually functioned rather than describing. And there's this real, again, this sort of this element that once data makes it in a smart city context, whether or not it's well constructed or ill constructed, it still starts shaping reality. And again, this is something I'm wanting to be concerned about. And thinking about how these decisions to measure or include are made. There's some great work. Evelyn Rupert is talking about sort of the social life of methods. How are these methods constructed in the first place? Rob Kitchen talks about we need to sort of do these sort of genealogies on the ways in which the data assemblages are created. Where is the data coming about? Who's collecting it? What are sort of the motivations for it as well? So again, this is the stuff I think we really need to be concerned about and highlight, and what I sort of fear within sort of smart city policies tend to get short shrift. And I think I'll just move on to some conclusions now. I'll skip that last slide, sort of a bit repetitive. So I guess just to finalize these things, that I am trying to walk this line. I am not really a GI science type of quant person in terms of how I think about and what I'm sort of interested in doing. I'm very much coming from city and regional planning is already confessed, but very much sort of a human geographer, thinking about how these kind of processes get set up. And I'm really interested in how we might use big data, because I think there's lots of exciting potential here. And we really just sort of started this, and I think more, and I guess it's sort of a call for more human geographers to think about how they might incorporate some of these digital technologies, these data, into their own work. Maybe in teams with other folks, because it really does have an interesting and important element to how we understand cities, our daily lives, and so forth. And I think there's really, there are some real opportunities to bring this. This is sort of, in my mind, a real sort of sweet, interesting spot to be, to have this sort of work with these data that might allow us to ask new questions that we weren't really able to answer before, gain insight in ways we weren't able to do that before. But I really worry about the folks who are doing this right now, and that sort of slide of all the big data journals tend not to be very sophisticated in their theory and their situational knowledge and their sort of topical knowledge, that they'll come up with really sort of interesting ways of manipulating data, but not necessarily provide much meaning whatsoever. Another thing, so an example of this is some people talk about using small big data. You start with big data, you basically sample and bring it down till you're talking about a couple hundred tweets rather than a million tweets or things like that. I mean, that you can sometimes, one of the real advantages of having this big collection is that you can narrow down on very specific phenomena you might want to look at that you wouldn't really have any sort of measurement or any sort of insight on. But because there's so much information to start with, you can get down to a few dozen, a few hundred of whatever you're looking at. and interrogate those through, qualitative methods. This is some of the stuff we've been playing around with as well. That it's not just about running some sort of big model. Some of the simple statistics can also be quite useful as well. So just to sort of finish up, again, I just want to go back to the Medina, some of Medina's work in thinking about this project CyberSim in Chile during Allende's time. That what is the vision for this kind of stuff? I guess in some ways I'm thinking that this data availability is there. People are going to be using it. It is how might we use it? What are other visions besides the more smart city neoliberal kind of vision? And I put this in because this is a shot from one of the sort of technical manuals or sort of reports from the cyber project, and it's very sort of interesting that at the center of this whole thing is the worker. That was sort of the priority for this particular project, and it really brings up questions about what are the priorities for how we might be used sort of data-driven activism perhaps in cities today. And this last little line, get data or data will be got, sort of play off our map, the idea of map will be map. That this is the kind of thing. This is happening. There are people seeking to define cities through these sort of techniques. And I think a way forward, an important way forward, is to engage, critique, work with these people. And so it's not just a certain set of values, a certain set of ideologies pushing this forward. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Matt, if you'd like to call on people for questions, it's
Sure.
floor yours.
All right.
I'll go with that. I'm mostly a fan of this stuff, as you know, but you do raise a couple things which I think we have to be really careful about. One is this idea of democratization of data, and it's democratization as long as you can afford it. There's an example where there's the iPhone app called See-Click-Fix,
Yeah.
where if you take a pothole or a broken street light, you can take a picture, it gets a geo-reference. If your city participates in this, you could send it off to the city and they send someone out to fix it. Someone did a study in Boston showing that, of course, the people who use that are mostly from affluent neighborhoods. So over time, the city started to repair potholes and streetlights in affluent parts of the neighborhood of the city and started to neglect less affluent parts.
Yeah. I totally agree. There's actually, I took a slide out earlier that was talking, I think it might be the same thing, it was called Street Bump.
That could have been that too, yeah.
There's an app called Street Bump, but essentially the idea is you download it, you put your phone on in your car, and it has an accelerometer so it can measure if there's a bump there. And if people are driving and there's a lot of that sort of bumping happening in a certain location, that's an indicator of it's problem. Of course, it all is driven by where people with smartphones who decided to download this app are driving. And so it's, I don't think there's ever been a study on that particular app, but there is exactly that concern that I don't want to oversell the democratic part of this stuff. I mean, it's still very much, it is, who is using this app. This is one of the issues with the Twitter data, and this is sort of why we try to phrase questions in certain ways, that we know not everyone is using Twitter. Actually, in the U.S., it's sort of biased in some interesting ways. It's African Americans are more likely to be on Twitter than you would think by just a percentage of the population. But there's still sort of a bias in there. And then there's also who's actually doing Twitter and then deciding to geotag their tweets as well. And so that's why it starts getting problematic when you start using it as, let's have a vote, or what's public opinion on Twitter, because that's a very sort of biased sample. And even Twitter, I mean, I'm sort of critiquing some of these things that are the stop quotes as a data stream as convenience. Twitter is a data stream of convenience because it has a very sort of open, easy API. And if you wanted to look at other sort of social media, Instagram, for example, or some of these other things, it's a very different population. So you're not necessarily going to get a sample in the way that we would think of social media.
And the other thing I worry about is efficiency, and not just because it's neoliberal attempt to shrink the public sector. I worry about efficiency itself, because efficiency can actually make systems consume more resources. So we could actually make cities, less sustainable by making them more efficient. That sounds like a paradox. You may have heard of this. There was an English economist in the 19th century called William Stanley Jevons, and he discovered something called the Jevons paradox, where he studied coal usage in English industry. And he thought that, he looked at the efficiency of the processes and thought, well, as they get more efficient, they use less coal. What he found out is that as these industries got more efficient, they used more coal because it lowered the cost of production, lowered the price, and raised demand.
Yeah.
And I worry about that with smart cities, because we're making cities more efficient. We make cities less sustainable and less resilient. So I think we fetishized efficiency in the smart city movement. And I don't think that's why we should be making cities smarter.
Yeah.
I would agree with that as well.
If we go back and look at some of these examples, how much analytical work has really been done on this data you're presenting? Because most of you are showing just raw frequencies in these slides you're showing.
Actually, we're not showing frequencies. You're talking about some of the stuff at the beginning?
Well, if you go back to Wikipedia editing.
Oh, the Wikipedia stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is not the point of this is not, I guess I would agree, but I think this is still a very, important, finding, even though the analysis is not overly complex in terms of.
The way that's showing that, it assumes that there's uniform distribution of population across the world. We know that's not true.
Right.
If they took that and normalized it by population density, for example, I think they'd find a visualization would be much more revealing. And that's a classic error that people.
Well, I'll say, this is not, obviously there's parts of this that are very sparsely inhabited here, so it does overemphasize that aspect. But for me, the story we're trying to tell with this particular map is the parts of the world that are, the information is being written about by other people are concentrated in certain locations. Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, some other places. That it's not to suggest that this whole, that this is a densely populated part of the world, but just to say that that part of the world is, being marginalized in this way.
Because, for example, you see in northern Canada, you've got all of the Baffin Island as being the same level as Canada as a whole. And my guess is fewer people in Baffin Island doing this.
Criticism take. I will say part of this is the technical issue, because we're doing this through geolocating IP addresses.
Yeah.
You get it to the country level fairly well. Once you get to the country level, it'll start falling apart.
Okay.
And that's why. Yeah, that's why we played around with sort of subnational levels on this as well. And we saw results that were consistent with this, but we didn't feel that the technique was strong enough to actually show.
So it's going to be a while to get down the census tract.
But this particular thing, with IP addresses, at least in a trustworthy way.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is about, from your perspective as a city and regional planner, presumably there are problems that can be solved by using data from both traditional sources and maybe complemented by some of these new sources. I'm wondering, though, if the attention to big data is actually drawing money and resources out of the old data gathering efforts that are still producing pretty solid, good, reporting on infant deaths, whatever. Do you see kind of at the funding level a drift, a distraction from big data that seems still to be in the hammer looking for a nail phase rather than, in a meaningful problem fixing mode yet?
I will say I don't think I'll go so far as to say I can see evidence of this, but I'm very much share the concern, because that is something where you see. And you can see in sort of municipal budgets that they'll be hiring people. The example you might, or I guess the evidence for this, you might hire a chief information officer for a city and hire a bunch of sort of coders, analyst types, but not have replaced the local community planner who knows the set of activists and landowners and what have you in a particular neighborhood, and knows very much, what's going on in a very real sense. I mean, we were talking with Matt about sort of the difference between sort of the knowledge is you do see. I don't think I can document people losing their jobs because other people are being hired. We certainly see people spending money on these new sort of big data kind of jobs.
I can kind of follow up with a comment. There's another cautionary tale which has to do with Google flu trends.
Yeah.
You may have heard this story, but there's an article in Science, I think, last year about this, which is well worth reading, about how not to become slaves to big data.
Yeah.
And one thing they talked about was that Google flu trends worked really, really well, and it got a lot of attention, then suddenly it went off the tracks and it over-predicted flu. And part of the reason was that it created an echo chamber. So people heard about, oh, Google flu trends is predicting flu, and they start Googling Google flu trends, and that led to this positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
And one of the lessons they say in this paper, it's a very good paper in Science, I can look up the reference and send to you, but they say, don't forget administrative data. What were you trying to solve with Google flu trends that you couldn't do with CDC data?
Yeah.
So I think big data should be used where administrative data doesn't go.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't be throwing out administrative data, official data in favor of big data. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, but there is also that, and I'm somewhat hopeful because I think maybe in some ways that sort of the excitement about big data, so the unreasonable exuberance about big data is starting to sort of calm down a bit. For a while, it was just like, oh, we can do all this sort of stuff. And as, I think probably to their credit, as people started working with this more, they sort of realized, that's not going to be, But again, that doesn't stop the technology companies from still pumping it up too, because it's within their own interest.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on the project that you're thinking, that you're perhaps starting for gentrification. What are the questions you're asking, and how are you going to use, what kind of data are you looking for to answering it?
The gentrification, it's pretty specific. It's really looking at trying to look at the extent to which Airbnb might be driving some gentrification processes in certain cities. And this is actually not using social media at all. It's actually looking at there's an availability of where Airbnb places are being rented out. That's what we'd like to ask and sort of like to answer. I'm not sure if we'll be able to do that. We're just really starting to look at some of the patterns and things like that. So we're really, the question, is Airbnb, contributing, how's that impacting local housing? And we're sort of looking at, trying to look at vacancy rates and things like that, and thinking about how that might
I really like your citation about financial models. That financial models is not really about describing the market.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the things you talk about urban has already been talked about a lot in the market, in the financial sector, in the marketing industry and financial industry. Also like the big data, like Target can use big data to predict a girl is pregnant, even the girl, her father don't know. I think this has already happened a lot in the business sector, in the finance and marketing sector. And now we bring the same problem to the urban planning. It's actually we are facing the same problem. One is aspect is reflection is in the market, other reflection is in the urban planning. I think a lot of these issues you guys talk about is similar about what people has already been debated for decades in the market business. But I feel one advantage that compared to the market, compared to the financial sector, that urban planning do have is the Internet of Things. Because sometimes, like in the market is financial modeling is for those big guys who want to pay money to know the market and know where I'm going to invest. So people being marginalized, their voice sometimes cannot be heard. But in the city scenario, there are a lot of things, like when the light will open, when the nut trees will grow, and all those like Internet of Things. If we can combine people's ideas with the Internet of Things, the things is always data. They are generating data because I used to do green building, and building are generating a lot of data.
Right.
And that really combines with people's opinions. That really makes a lot of sense. And also, like Twitter can go much deeper compared to the market because there needs to be someone pay. I'm really interested in that market index, and someone will produce it. But in terms of urban planning, we do have an advantage, like a green building will generate data, whether people are interested.
Yeah.
Whether rich people are interested or poor people are interested, green building will generate data by itself.
Yeah.
So I remember in the end you bring up activists by big data. Use big data as a weapon to be an activist. So I'm thinking of the Internet of Things, like building, no matter the customers have big money to pay for it, or like the customers being marginalized, these things are always there to generate.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, I think there's lots of interest, lots of parallel between how business is done. I think my sort of one comment is the goals of business and marketing are very different than the goals of good city governance. Where there's all kinds of concerns about equity and being businesses are not designed to make sure that everyone is there's sort of equity across. Whereas city governments hopefully have that sort of goal. And there's one other thing I was going to say. And also, I think we were talking earlier about where the resources to do something like sort of activism kind of thing. We were talking about sort of digital labor earlier. There's a whole other set of questions of people who are working from Mechanical Turk. How is it possible to organize and perhaps resist some of these processes, or at least sort of try to shape them?
Because I used to have a business and finance degree, and also have landscape architecture and urban planning degree as you. And I see a lot of similarities about this data debate in these two different disciplines. And I see a lot of debate has already happened in the business, in finance. It's going to be repeated.
Just a quick comment. The interesting slide you showed, the 9 covers, I think, of the different things like big data and magazines.
Oh yeah.
What's the kind of timeline on that? Let's say we woke up today and didn't realize big data was around, and all of a sudden, well, 6 of 8. What's the timeline of this innovation diffusion? When do they come online?
These came online. I would say probably the past 3 or 4 years. Big Data Society, I guess this is a year and a half, 2 years at this point or something like that. And so there was some conversation. It was first conversation I had about this was the Los Angeles AAG, which what year was that?
2013, right?
2013?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so, I mean, finish your time.
But the reason I ask is I think it's a growing wave of a huge import, and you've probably heard that IBM has the Watson project, and they're actually acquiring companies because of their repositories of big data. So your assets are the fact that you have 2 million records or whatever that might be.
Yeah, well, there's a whole, this brings up a whole other set of, some more economic geography questions. What is now being valued? In some ways, computing power, and maybe arguably even sort of the ability to code. I've seen various attempts to essentially build sort of share or ways of coding that will sort of make it possible to do it more inexpensively or use less highly skilled labor to do this sort of thing. So increasingly, it's the ability to control data, sort of merge data, things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is not particularly a novel insight, but I just was struck by looking at the command center images about how kind of the site of governance has shifted pretty radically. I mean, and I guess the case of the pre-Olympics Rio command center is kind of strange because I think of this as being like the command center now in a weird way. I mean, I get directed by Google Sheets all the time. I mean, I get, I've turned all the indicators on for that, and so, I'll get messages saying, your flight to wherever El Paso is late, and it's like, I'm not flying there, and then I'll realize, oh, somebody emailed me, they're flying, and so then I'll find myself texting that person saying, hey, dude, your flight's late. There's this sort of
Yeah.
It's cooperative behavior, it's good.
Yeah, I mean, you become these sort of mini command centers, and people
Yeah.
will text you and text back, and so it's interesting to think about how that sort of centralized.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always say, man, when I always, when I do this, I always like show my phone, not because it's a particularly nice phone, the case is nice, but it's just like, I mean, it's just sort of this object of attention, it's like a mini command center, it's also a mini tracking center. I mean, in terms of, my phone knows where I am because it needs to know where I am because it is, in order to get a phone get a phone call to me. But these things are just gripping all kinds of information. I mean, there's some really interesting research out there that even the battery drain on your phone can give you an indication of your location because the farther you are away from a cell tower, the more power it takes to do it. And so even something as simply as like how much battery do you have can give some location information away. And of course, whenever we install an app on one of these things, we carefully read through the terms and conditions and make sure we don't do anything we find objectionable. No, we just click through, and these apps are collecting all kinds of data, and a lot of it is not really considered sensitive. I mean, battery life, that's actually kind of useful for an app. It doesn't want to drain your phone, but if it's being collected, it could also, be used to find out information about what you're doing. And when this stuff starts getting combined, it really gets much more powerful.
I guess I guess the point though is that rather than just simply objects of scrutiny by virtue of these things in our pockets, we've also become sort of operational nodes, fulfilling commands.
Yeah.
We're cyborgs.
Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, you point to the fact that people who have to take technical chops to analyze the data are not very critical, are not very necessarily thinking very critically about it.
I will say there's a tendency for that. I don't want to pigeonhole.
Fair enough. But there's
So,
and you've been thinking about it. So I would like to see your view. Do you think that this could be solved by teams, or should we be teaching Python and sociologists and Foucault to coders? How much can you actually get from a team that really maybe even be interested in solving the problem?
yeah. No, I mean,
Class.
No, I mean, because I think about how important of an individual that's capable of integrating these two views. I sort of work in interface of different things, and I have a hard time sometimes. We have the same goal.
Yeah.
And we're willing, but still.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's true. I mean, I think ideally having that within the same, like those sort of abilities or tendencies in the same person is really, really useful. And particularly because people can act as sort of like, sort of translators, transitions between other people who, are one way or the other way. But still, it's tough because, but honestly, I don't want to sit down and try to learn Ruby code because, that's actually kind of tough. And I know Perl, so I'll stick with Perl. But and so I'm making that decision not to do that. But it is, I think and I guess part of this, I'm a part of this thing called the Big Data and Ethics Council, where we're sort of talking specifically. It's sort of along these same lines. It's because there's all kinds of ethical issues that come out of this, and the question we're trying to answer is, how do you get people who don't think they're dealing with human subjects thinking about how they're dealing with human subjects? And because again, and the thing we also want to do, we don't want it to be like sort of an IRB kind of checklist kind of thing. It's like check, 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 check. It's how to bring these sort of questions, in the sort of the educational models that these people are getting trained in. And I don't think we necessarily have a silver bullet for these sort of things, but I do think it's, one of the things we're developing is trying to come up with these specific case studies showing, okay, here's how this big data thing might be causing harm to someone, and trying to build case studies from people who've actually encountered this stuff. And I will say, I want to be clear, I don't want to pigeonhole sort of data scientists and stuff like that, even though in some ways they're a bit of a small person for me in this talk. Because ultimately, they're the ones who have to sit down and code this stuff out and think about how, what parameters to put in there. And, it's easy, it's easy to talk about, you have to be, situate this data when you have to come up with a variable. Do we make this variable 2 or do we make this variable 3? To make something work, you have to put 2 or 3 in there. And so people do think about this sort of, thoughtfully. Yeah. Sort of long, perhaps, incoherent answer.
Just a more general question.
Hal, we're going to go for one more question.
Just a very general question, you have big data up there. One thing you didn't do when you started is give your definition of what you see as big data. What is big data and what isn't? We need to know that so we have some idea what we're dealing with.
Yeah, big data is a bunch of different definitions. It's essentially my working definition. I don't have a clear, like it's a certain size or something like that. Essentially, it's like real time. It is often sort of unstructured, and in my particular case, it's about sort of human interaction that we would have seen before, human activity.
Does census data count as big data?
We're not counting on census data. This is a whole, whole set of debates that I'm probably going to politely sidestep. I would say census data is not, in some ways it very much counts as big data, but because of the sort of timeliness factor, I would probably push it in a different category.
So you need a really authoritative definition of those things.
Yeah, and there are some out there.
Interesting. Thank you.
Well, we'd like to thank Matt for an excellent talk. I invite you all to join us for a reception in the lobby after.